In this episode, I am joined by Rebekah Sturgill, mother, schoolteacher, and convert to Orthodox Christianity. Rebekah details her upbringing in a Texan Evangelical Church and how encounters with authoritarianism and questions about her sexuality saw her leave the religion. Rebekah describes a period of passionate teenage atheism before becoming deeply involved in feminist activism beginning in university. Rebekah explains why she remains a feminist but left activism, and how, through a powerful visionary experience, she converted to Orthodox Christianity. Rebekah also explores the mechanisms of conversion, considers the line between faith and extremism, and comments on the pros and cons of a new trend of conversions to Orthodox Christianity, driven by internet influencers and discussion communities. So without further ado, Rebekah Sturgill. Rebekah Sturgill, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
I'm so delighted to be talking with you today. Gosh, this has been a conversation months, maybe a year, longer, I don't know, in the making. How long has it been since we decided we were going to do this?
It's been several months at least. I don't know if it's been quite a year.
Yes, well, those have been very long months because you have such an interesting story. And there are so many interesting things that I hope we get to cover them all today that I'd like to ask you about. And the first of those is your own faith journey. You've walked a very interesting path to arrive as you are now in the Orthodox Christian Church, in the Orthodox Christian faith. I wonder if you might take us through that journey, perhaps starting even your childhood. What was the context of your upbringing?
Yeah, so I grew up in Texas, Protestant, vaguely evangelical, but not really part of the, evangelical megachurch, non-denominational thing that we often see. No rock band, no fog machines, but Protestant church in Texas. Grew up there, and my family was very involved. As a kid, we joined when I was 4 or 5 when we moved to an area. We found a church that we liked. And yeah, I grew up quite involved in church, going multiple times a week. Most of my best friends were there, and really loving it. And then through a lot of different things, personal things with my family, stuff going on with the church itself, we just ended up slowly leaving completely by the time I was 16 or 17. So I grew up loving church, and then by the end of high school, I really hated church. And I got really involved in a lot of the Twitter atheist, new atheist things, and would carry the God delusion in my backpack so that I could prove people wrong. And yeah, I spent a couple of years really being angry with religion generally. In the background of this, my dad has always been quite a seeker. So even though we were growing up in church, he was, we'd be going to church events, and he would be bringing a copy of Siddhartha, and he would put paper covers on it so that no one could see what he was reading. So he was always seeking. He was always reading about other faiths. He was visiting other places. I remember after 9/11, him reaching out to a lot of the Muslims in our community and then going to mosque with them. So it's very strange because when you say I grew up in a Protestant church in Texas, it doesn't really cover the whole story, because I had that many people would see as a very fundamentalist upbringing, but my family itself wasn't at all part of that kind of zeitgeist. So I left any type of religious practice for many years. And then I went to St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I had to actually read philosophy and read theology and take it seriously. And I had to read the Bible and take it seriously. And I found that when I actually read the gospel, and I encountered Jesus again for the first time in many years, and it wasn't in the same context, I suddenly found I really liked him. And this was in a really appealing, at the time it felt like an appealing character. appealing ideas. What I was reading didn't seem to match with what I had heard about God. And so I really was struggling with this for many years. I had some friends who we all grew up in similar churches, and I think it was junior or senior year of college, we went a couple Sundays to a church that was very similar to the church I grew up in. And, we wanted to sing hymns that we grew up singing, and we just wanted that familiarity. But I wasn't ready to join any type of church. It was more, at that point, it was more about healing kind of the anger that I felt at the time. So I was in that space for several years. And while I was there, I was also very involved politically, going to a lot of protests, a lot of political activism on the more left-wing feminist, different types of feminism. That was a whole journey in itself for me and my understanding of feminism, but definitely still involved in those circles. Yes, and then so after many years of this and kind of doing a lot of the political activism and reading about theology on my own, I got to the point where I realized if I was going to, if I wanted to try out what it was like to have faith again, to actually practice something, I had to do it with other people. And so I made a list of churches to visit because I figured I thought I was a Christian. I'd read the Bible, was interested in what Jesus was saying. So I thought, well, if I'm going to do something, I'm probably going to be a Christian, but I don't know what that looks like other than how I saw it, and I don't want to do that. So I made a list of churches to visit, and then a friend of mine, Joshua Sturgill, that's the last name's important there. I knew he went to a weird church that was kind of different, and it wasn't Catholic and it wasn't Protestant, and I knew nothing else about Orthodoxy at that point. But I knew that I trusted the person who went to that church. And I knew he wasn't going to go to a church that was a fundamentalist church, that it was going to be a place where any questions I had could be taken seriously. And so I just went one Sunday, knowing nothing else. And about a year later, I was brought into the Orthodox Church. So it was, yeah, there was kind of a conversion at that moment and over the course of that year as I learned more specifically about the Orthodox Church, but there was quite a journey leading there, and all these small conversions along the way as well, and a lot of changing understanding. So I've now been Orthodox for many years, and Joshua and I got married, which took place a couple years later and was quite surprising to everyone. And that's where I am now, as an Orthodox Christian.
Very interesting. Thank you. I wonder if we might backtrack over some of those points. When you were a teenager, what happened in that church that caused you to become very angry, as you described, with religion? I seem to recall there was something that happened that was quite gnarly.
Gnarly, I do appreciate that. I think there was a lot of things. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. The biggest aspect of that was that I was really questioning my sexuality. I ended up coming out as a lesbian, and that being there was tension, obviously, but there was also a lot of inability to have conversations about it. So I distinctly remember a time when I was sitting with a friend of mine who's also gay, and we're sitting with some older people at the church, and they were discussing the Westboro Baptist Church, which, if you are abroad and you don't know who that is, I'm so excited for you. Technically, I think in the loosest terms, a church, but classified as a hate group, and they protest soldiers' funerals or other events, usually with signs that say things like "God hates fags." And so these people were talking about this group protesting a soldier's funeral, and I just remembered them distinctly saying, that's not the right thing to do, but their hearts are in the right places. And just being horrified, thinking, how is it people holding signs saying God hates America, God hates all these people, how are these people with their hearts in the right places? So there's a lot of tension as this church was trying to figure out how to address some of these issues that were coming up politically. This was the early 2000s. Gay marriage is starting to be legalized slowly. So I had a lot of conflict, and I didn't have any way to deal with it within the context of the church. Additionally, I think this is a much broader conversation. I think generally churches have issues talking about any type of issues associated with LGBTQ issues, because there's this idea that if you realize that you're gay, if you realize anything about yourself, they just say that being gay is a sin. And so therefore I'm like this 13-year-old. I realize that I'm definitely attracted to women, and therefore no matter what I've done and no matter who I am or what I choose to do, I'm sinful and I can't get out of that. And they had no way to deal with this. And so I'm under a lot of stress as a young person trying to figure out who I am, what I believe, where I, all of these things. My parents see that I'm under a lot of stress. A lot of things hit the fan at the church around issues of power and authority. This was a church that isn't part of a larger denomination. And so the senior minister would be in charge of everything. And that can be really unhealthy. And so someone has complete power, they can make a lot of horrible choices and no one can stop them. So there was a lot of issues coming to a head at the church at the time, as far as how we discuss problems, how we discuss things like homosexuality, and how the church itself functions. And so it just, things just fell apart, and my whole family kind of stepped out of it, which was quite sad. I mean, it was my home growing up. I remember my parents talking about how it was obvious that this was my favorite place to be, but I needed some distance in order to work through all of these things. So yeah, was that gnarly enough?
Did your family step out because of the tension between your emerging sense of your sexuality and the position of that particular church? Is that what caused the family itself to step out?
I think that was definitely a large aspect. I think my dad was also struggling with a lot of tension. Like I said, he's always been a seeker, and then he's in this situation where even though the church itself wasn't fundamentalist in the way that people often think about, like a Southern fundamentalist church, there was still certain fundamentalism, some certain fundamentalist streak. And so I think he just reached a point where he thought, I don't know if I believe this, and I think I have a lot of questions, and I don't know if I can be committed to this. This is something. Um, so I think I know that was an aspect of it, but I think there was also a lot going on personally with my parents, and then my siblings who are younger. My brother never quite liked going to youth group. He didn't have the same friend group that I had, so church was just this thing that he had to do. So he didn't really have any buy-in. My sister didn't really have any buy-in, and then I think my parents and I were struggling with some of these other things, and they were seeing that I was suffering because of this, and so it just, and there stopped being reasons to go. It was more of reasons why staying home would be better. So, but I don't know. I haven't talked with my parents in details about it, but I do know that was definitely a huge aspect of it for them.
You've spoken about the community aspect of the church. Another aspect of religion is the, if you want, inner experience, you could say, the way in which the individual relates not only to the community, but also to the tenets of the faith, maybe even to God, actually. Relationship with God, that sort of thing, prayer life, contemplative life, scriptural study, etc. These sorts of what are sometimes called in the evangelical movement quiet time. That the sort of thing that goes in the quiet time, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Christian meditation, in some ways, we could say. What was that aspect alive for you in your teenage years?
No, I think I don't know if I really had enough of a formation in that individual, um, like how to structure that for oneself when I was younger. And so when I left, I think I just had so much anger generally, and I didn't know if I was angry at people or God or who. I didn't know who I was angry with. Um, and so I didn't really have that. I was intellectually curious, and I still was doing all of this reading on my own and really trying to understand um, a lot of these questions. I made the flippant comment about having the God delusion, but I really tried to see. I'd never really heard what atheism was or why someone would be an atheist, because in the context I grew up in, everyone was a Christian by default. Even if they didn't really go to church, their family would still identify as being Christian. And so, really spending a lot of time reading people who were not necessarily followers of any faith, whether it was more of an agnostic or very hard atheist line. And so there was an intellectual desire to know. And when I first started reading books again at St. John's on theology, I remember saying, I really just want someone to lay out, here's the 10 reasons why you should believe in God. And I proved it. And I really wanted that logical thing. So I didn't have a lot of that inner life formation. And I think that's such a huge part of Orthodox Christianity. And that's been a huge um, tension now as an Orthodox Christian, is having to learn how to do that in my 30s, taking that time and seeing how important that is, that time for contemplation. And yeah, that might be characterized as meditation, prayer. There's lots of different ways that people think about this, but it wasn't really part of my teenage years. I was really, yeah, I think I was too fueled by anger for that to be part of it then.
Mm. And in your Christian years, it hadn't come online. It was primarily a community experience.
Yeah, it was you go to youth group and you do all of these things, and at different times we would be encouraged to, like, have a prayer journal or something like that, but um I don't remember setting aside time for praying and every evening or things. It was like we would, when I was younger, before the family would leave for the day, we would all say some sort of morning prayer together, usually led by my dad. And we pray before meals, but I didn't have a sense of taking time like every evening to pray. There was sense, I mean, it's a Protestant church in the American South, so there was definitely a sense of reading the Bible and memorizing it, but I still didn't know necessarily how to do that on my own. Like no sense of like Lectio Divina or something like that. This sacred studying of reading and taking it into oneself. That wasn't really part of what I learned. Yeah.
I'd like to talk about those things a bit later with you, how you started to discover those and learn about them. How did you encounter atheism? Do you remember? And who were you reading, and how obnoxious were you in your
Oh, I was so obnoxious.
militant? I think everyone has that phase.
Everyone, yeah, every teenager is going to be obnoxious about something, and so I was going to be obnoxious about atheism for a while, but I don't know how I discovered. I think it was just I was kind of questioning, like, are there people who don't believe in God? But it was the time as well. This would have been like 2008, 2009. So Bill
YouTube.
Maher's document, yeah, YouTube, like early YouTube. Bill Maher has what was the name? Religiosity, whatever the name of that documentary. Ken Ham and Bill Nye are debating, and Richard Dawkins has documentaries. And I was very interested in science. I was studying science a lot. So if I'm looking up things about physics or astronomy, these things are coming up as well. So I think it just kind of naturally came from uh, some of my intellectual interest in science, and kind of my anger at Christianity, and then the YouTube algorithm presented atheism to me. So it was comforting because it is a type of fundamentalism. The idea that I can absolutely know this, snot-nosed 15-year-old, I can absolutely know there is no God. Um, there was a comfort to that, because then a lot of my problems and a lot of the tensions I was feeling went away, because who I felt was my interlocutor in these arguments didn't exist. So I'm sure I was quite obnoxious. Yeah, I remember reading The God Delusion. I remember reading like every copy of a Richard Dawkins book I could get my hands on. Um, and also, and then at this time being quite annoyed with my father, who was really starting to dive into Buddhism and reading Buddhist texts, and some of them are more popular, some less so. He's reading Thich Nhat Hanh, and I just remember being so annoyed with him. It's like, there's no such thing as God. Why are you so concerned with spirituality? Getting a master's degree in Eastern classics later in my life really humbled me on that one. But yeah, I was very convinced, outwardly at least, that there was no God, and I definitely was going to make people aware that I felt that way.
Did this emerging atheism create a schism between your family and yourself at that time, or was that difference accommodated by the family unit?
No, I think everyone was kind of going through, in my family, everyone was kind of going through kind of a period of questioning, a period of, what is this? I think uh, yeah, my parents, there was never any issues. And my parents, even when I became an Orthodox Christian, there's never been any type of issues with that. My parents came to Santa Fe whenever I was brought into the church. And I think they understand, my parents understand how they have been on their own journeys themselves. And so they're very accepting of all of the different journeys that their kids have all been on. And so yeah, and I was able to talk about all these things with my parents. My dad and I were watching a lot of the same documentaries together. Because I think he was the other person in the family who felt a lot of anger around what was going on with the church. And so, yeah, we both were interested in all of this idea of agnosticism and atheism. And my mom was along for the ride and was just fine with it. Like, there wasn't some sort of issue like, oh, well, we left this church, we need to go to a different one. It was, this is where we need to be right now. Which, I mean, in Protestant Christianity, you don't need necessarily a church. It's helpful, and a lot of Protestants will tell you that it's very helpful, but it's really about your relationship with God. And so if we're leaving church, or we're looking at all these different things, there's not really the type of existential issue that there might be if you had been Catholic and left a Catholic church, for instance. So yeah, my family, even though when we've all had quite different paths or different places we've all still remained very close, which I've been very thankful for in my life.
What about the activism? When did you start to become engaged in that? And could you detail, I mean, I'm really interested in the journey into it, the becoming aware of it, and which particular positions, political or moral, you began to take up, and how that unfolded in terms of practical application. I know you got very, very involved indeed in that aspect. So would you mind plotting that arc, that trajectory a bit?
Do my best, yes. As a teenager, I'm getting involved in atheism. I'm leaving the church. I'm looking for alternatives. I'm online. This is also the time of Tumblr, and so I'm, going on Tumblr so I can, read about Harry Potter and things like that. And then it turns into a lot of political activism, and I start kind of seeing what feminism is, which there's so many. It's a very loaded term, and that's a very difficult thing to dissect. But I started seeing, as I'm getting older, I'm learning more about the world. I'm seeing the ways in which I see that women are suppressed, or subjugated, oppressed, having problems across the world. And so I'm taking it personally. I I'm a young woman. I'm realizing that I'm attracted to women, so I'm taking up women's rights as a cause seems very natural. And in kind of the atmosphere of Tumblr at the time, it was this is just like the bare minimum of being a good human is kind of taking up a lot of these causes without going into details about what those how to take up those causes, which we get into those problems later. So I got very involved in like pro-choice movements and raising money and going to protests, and helped organize some conferences when I was in Massachusetts for a little bit. So I think I was just interested in feminism generally because it seemed like just the right thing to do, and it was a moral framework. And then as I was reading philosophy in college and started to kind of wrestle with some of the issues of relativism and absolutism, I started to see some of the issues that arose within feminist thinking, where I don't know, this very Western laissez-faire, this is the right thing because people should just do whatever they whatever feels right to them. When you apply that to problems across the world, then you start seeing things like, well, maybe female genital mutilation isn't really that bad because this is someone else's culture and I can't speak to someone's culture. And so I started to get really upset seeing some of these things in feminist circles, issues around pornography. Maybe porn is good because people are choosing to do it. And so I started getting more involved in reading and interacting with more second wave feminists, which, you know, many people would associate with TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminist. And that wasn't necessarily who I was interacting with and what I was talking with, but it was very much an idea of we're helping women, here's who women are. And it was, less of the everyone just do what they want and that's what we're fighting for. So I started to kind of being involved in feminism really deepen my understanding of philosophy and kind of realizing where I stood on a lot of moral issues and philosophical considerations. So there was quite a journey within that, which I think led me to where I am now. So I don't know if that quite answers the question. It's difficult to turn one's life into a story and to remember what it was like then, and rather than what it's like looking back on it now. And a lot of these things that seemed like they took very long actually took place in a very short amount of time. And some of the things that took longer in time, there just wasn't very much change in certain years. So yes, I'm hoping I'm explaining myself well, but I'm not sure if I am.
No, it's very interesting. You know, one of the themes we've talked about before, informally, is this process of conversion, or process of changing one's mind, or the process of adopting a particular view, and how that happens. You've gone through several significant changes in worldview in your life. And that's one of the reasons that we thought it would be interesting to have this conversation, to just track that a bit. It seems that, and see if you think this is right or not, it seems like part of what was happening, part of the mechanism for the atheism and the activism was the internet.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's been this is also something we've talked about informally, that's been a large part of many people's conversion is the internet, and it being a way for people to experience the world outside of where they were, where they grew up and what they were introduced to. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. I think, so I think thinking about conversion and thinking about the process of conversion, the going from faith to atheism felt very blunt and very sudden because it came from anger. Kind of my coming to be a feminist and understand what feminism was, it felt very fluid and was constantly changing. I knew that there was an ideal there that I was searching for, and wanted to do something about, wanted to put into action my thoughts. But then as I was those thoughts were becoming more nuanced as I was learning more about philosophy, as I was getting more information about what was really going on in the world, things like this. And so there was kind of a slower change there that was just going on along with my intellectual development. But it still was a change of worldview as I was, really, I spent a lot of my college years grappling with moral relativism and what I thought of it, because I realized that so much of the people around me were taking it for granted that this was true, and that I had taken for granted that this was true, and I wasn't sure if it was. And so, I think that kind of grappling with that wasn't necessarily a conversion, especially not a road to Damascus moment, but it certainly was a huge factor in how my worldview really solidified as I became an adult. I think there's also an element with conversion where we see the external things. Like, it's very easy to see chapters of my story would be, Protestant, evangelical, atheist, feminist, activist, Orthodox Christian, and that's very confusing. And there's quite a lot of whiplash going there. But then as I've spent more time thinking about it, in part from our conversations, I wonder how much my worldview has really changed, or if I just developed the language to talk about it. Because when I think of what my worldview is now as an Orthodox Christian, there's definitely a deeper understanding than I had many years ago, especially with relating to things of the supernatural. But a lot of the seeds of that came about from a lot of conversations I had when I was 18 and 19. I was in college and I'm reading philosophy. It was like I saw part of the picture, and then it was slowly expanding, or I saw, different parts of it, and they came together. So as far as conversion goes, when I became an Orthodox Christian, I don't think my worldview honestly did change. And I'm not sure, I could be wrong about that and thinking through my own experience, but did my worldview change, or did I finally have the language to express what I felt to be true? Because I definitely had the experience as I was learning about Orthodoxy, and I studied with a priest. He would say, well, many people have issues with this topic, for instance. And I would say, well, yeah, why? That makes sense. And it felt very easy because it just felt like everything fell into place. So I wonder, thinking through what conversion is, what moments in my life were real conversions. Were there many? Was there just one or two? I'm not really sure. I'm still wrestling with that myself.
You said a few times that you began to understand what feminism is. You said this. I began to understand what feminism is. And presumably that's contrasted against what feminism isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there are some misunderstandings people have about that, or that you had about that. What is behind this phrase you've been using, discovering what feminism is? And in that case, what is the feminism that you discovered? And it's okay to get technical here if
I think I came to looking into what feminism might be, this term feminism, because I was a young woman who was struggling with what it meant to be a woman. And that has really been, I think, a huge component to a lot of my understanding, even now, as a woman in my 30s, but still never quite feeling like I fit in with all the other women, which I think I'll actually most people feel like at some point. I was just chatting with a friend about that, where he was saying something similarly about masculinity. So I think part of it was in trying to understand what it meant as I'm getting older. I'm not a young girl anymore. I'm going to be a woman. What does that even mean? And so feminism obviously is related to that. So I'm looking into this term feminism. And so, yeah, I think ended up getting frustrated with some of the more popular or third wave types of feminism, was that I felt almost like I had to recreate the wheel as a woman. Like, feminism is about your personal choice. It's about, it applies to all women, but we can't necessarily define what a woman is. And I'm not trying to get into some sort of like, gotcha, this is the definition of a woman, but really struggling in any type of way to define what this is. And it all becomes as soon as you start to prod at it, becomes very fluid in a way that's not helpful. And I was looking for something that was very grounded, something that was about my experience as a woman, other people's experience being women, what our shared struggles were, our shared issues, and what does it mean to overcome those issues and working towards justice. And as I got into more popular feminism, there just wasn't any substance there. It didn't feel like there was any real answers to some of these problems. So then I'm looking into things like intersectionality, which is still related to some of the third wave feminist stuff, where you have to talk about the relationship between all of these different things. What does it mean to be a woman of a different race or an age, or all of these other characteristics? But then as I saw that playing out in activist circles, it became, while the theory itself was really helpful, it became a game of how many things can I check off the list? And so talking about the experience as a woman we stopped being able to have that conversation as well, because it was all about, well, what else are you? And so, yeah, I became, as I was struggling with moral relativism in a very philosophical sense, I became very attracted to second wave feminism. I was reading a lot of Adrienne Rich, and really, I found a lot of comfort in the idea of that there's no correct way to be a woman. You just are a woman because you are one. And I think a lot of people struggle with that, and they think it's some sort of biological determinism. Like, if you are born female, therefore you're a woman. That's obviously reductionist, and it puts you in a box, but I found it very freeing because I no longer had to decide who I was. I no longer had to create an identity for myself. I no longer had to figure out, am I a woman or not? I just was one, and I didn't have to try to do a good job of that. So I found that, yeah, very comforting, that I didn't have to dress a certain way or act a certain way or be interested in certain things. It was taken for granted that I was a woman, and we could go from there, and we could work together. And obviously, many people who are biologically female have different experiences. That's no one is claiming that all people who have the same biological sex have the same experience. That's not what's being argued. But there were certain experiences that were shared, and so that was foundation. That was a foundation for me, that I was able to ask some of these questions, and have a groundwork with which to do it. And so some of the more third wave feminism that I was being introduced to, like via Tumblr or something like that, it wasn't necessarily shallow, but it was so fluid. There was nothing to stand on. And we were constantly having to ask very fundamental questions about definitions that I wanted to do good work, and I wanted to help people around me, and I wanted to not spend all my time worrying about what it meant for me to be a woman. And so I was very attracted to that second wave feminist movement, which is not very popular these days. So I think that answered the question.
Yes. I wonder, this urge to do good and to help people. In this case, helping women achieve justice. I think that if I'm now recapitulating what I heard you say. Of course, this urge to help others, particularly through activism, let's say, has other expressions available to it. For example, some people want to save animals or protect nature, for example, or help refugees and so on. I mean, there are many, I think, activist options for that, which fit the definition of, for those involved in them anyway, fit the definition of trying to help other people, or others, if that other is an animal or nature or so. Do you have a sense as to why it was feminism and helping women that particularly enlivened you and attracted you? And did you experiment with activism in other forms?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you were talking, I was thinking about Paul Kingsnorth, who has the book, Reflections of or Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist. And so he had a very similar experience. He's also now an Orthodox Christian, but he was very involved in environmental activism. And, the book is The Recovering Environmentalist. And so there's this, I think, this idea that if you read it, he's going to talk about how he just, went out and bought a diesel truck and is just salting the earth. But really his love of nature and his love of the world, it has transformed to something different, but it started off that way. And I think my understanding feminism, my understanding of my own sexuality, and all of these things, it's part of a calling that I think I have, and I've been trying to figure out what it is. I think that there's some particular calling that I have related to helping women. And I really don't have an answer for what that means. How it shows up a lot now as a teacher, and I'm working with teenage girls and trying to be someone who's helpful to them when they feel very lost. So there's some sort of particular calling in my life that maybe one day when I grow up, I'll figure out what it is, but it's something related to women. And so I think a lot of people have some sort of particular thing like that, like Paul Kingsnorth's relationship with nature and the earth. It's transformed over his life, but it's always been there. And so I think my desire to connect with women and to support women has always been there, and it just has evolved as my life has gone on and as certain philosophical understandings of mine have changed. And so, I mean, I remember being little and wanting to talk to my grandmother and know all the stories about her childhood and things like that. And so there's some sort of connecting with other women that has always been important in my life. And so feminism was an aspect of that, certainly, but I think it's still there. I mean, I got, whenever I was in college, I got a Venus symbol tattooed on my wrist, and to remind myself that this felt like a calling. And I thought, when I kind of walked away from political activism with a bad taste in my mouth, I thought maybe I should get it covered up, and I've left it because that's still such an important part of who I feel I am and what my job is. So I don't think I have any answers for how that actually looks now.
Some religions have articles of faith, key points, right? And often there are books if you believe these four things, then you're a Buddhist, right? Like, what's the essential thing for a Buddhist to believe, given all the different types of Buddhism and all that? Or what is the essential thing for a Christian to believe, or a Catholic to believe, or a Methodist to believe, or that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder now, what doctrinal points from feminism do you still hold, in the sense that there's a sense of, from, if I've heard you correctly, you're still a feminist, but you're being quite careful to define that. It's sort of in the
Mm-hmm.
orbit of second wave. Do you have a kind of a sort of Apostles' Creed of
Do I have an Apostles' Creed of feminism?
what has survived from that time? I mean to say, really, if I try to be a little less meandering about this question, what has survived from that time in you to do with
because there's the connecting thread, so there must be something that survived. I don't know if I necessarily identify with the term feminist anymore, but I do think that there's a lot of things connecting my thought at the time and my experience at the time to now. I think there's so much baggage with that word. I always hesitate to use it, but I also don't avoid using it. It's so the term itself is so loaded. I struggle with it. But I think for the Apostles' Creed, I have to think about that specifically a little bit more. But the idea that men and women are different, and that there is something shared between women that men can't experience or understand, but that there's no sense of inequality. So that doesn't mean, I think there's this idea that if men and women are different, therefore one must be better than the other. And this comes up quite a lot in Christian circles, thinking about, are men and women complementary? Are they equal? There's lots of different specific terms and talking about it within Christianity. But men are not better than women, women are not better than men, but there's some sort of difference to them. And I think my understanding of that has become more and more, I also hesitate to use that word, mystical. It's something more inexplicable than I think I understood it to be whenever I was more involved in political activism, as opposed to now when I'm really rooted in Orthodox Christianity. It can't just come down to biology, but biology is related, and there's something that we can learn from the difference in biology. But it doesn't have the whole answer. So I think in Christianity, every single person is created in the image of God. So in Orthodox Christianity, we have iconography, and we use icons as part of our worship. It's not just decoration, it's not art, it's part of our worship. And so we talk about how every person is an icon. Every person is in the image of God and points others to God. And that's part of what one's purpose is, and that's part of how we interact with other people. And so the idea of subjugating anyone based off of race or sex or anything is like, oh, I don't like this particular image of God. And so I think I now have better terminology for that idea of what equality really is and what it means, that I first came to believe in when I was more involved in political activism. So yeah, I think to summarize it better, I think men and women are equal. That doesn't mean that they're the same, and that's going to be really difficult to figure out. But that's part of the project. And so thinking that men and women are equal doesn't mean that they're identical and that they can and should do all the same things. But saying that they're different doesn't mean that one is necessarily better than the other. So I think I came to understand that in feminism and really started to see that in my theological studies as well.
Is there anything in there that, in your mind, flags as controversial in the context of some of the groups you've been involved in?
I feel like I'm always going to be flagged as controversial by someone, mostly by groups I've previously been involved with. Yeah, I mean, we're currently in a moment where it's very difficult to talk about sex and our relationship with sex, what it means to be a man or a woman. I don't think we have, as a culture, we don't have enough of a shared vocabulary or shared understanding of ontology of what a human being is to really get anywhere with it. And so I think many people could hear what I'm talking about and think that, I don't know, I hate trans people or something like that, something ridiculous. Um, and I'm going to talk about how everyone is made in the image of God and everyone's an icon of God, but therefore I must hate a certain group of people. I get that quite often. So yeah, I think there's talking about any type of belief that's so fundamental to our own understanding of ourselves, to our own understanding of the world. We're going to have to make some very clear definitions, and I think we're quite bad as a culture right now of explaining ourselves and explaining our definitions. So I'm sure that lots of what I've said has been very controversial to certain people and in new and interesting ways that I won't even be able to predict. But so yes, I think I'm sure I'm being controversial.
You mentioned that you left activism with a bad taste in your mouth. What happened there?
I think it was more about the philosophical, um, realizing that I was trying to have some conversations around definitions and around what we really believed and trying to get to the root of the issue, and that these things were controversial. Uh, you know, it was people who, a lot of people, including myself, become activists because they're angry about something. And becoming an activist doesn't deal with the anger, it just redirects it. But if you get all these angry people in a room together, um, myself very much included in that, it's quite explosive and it's not conducive to real conversation. And so I think I was attracted to activism because I wanted to put what I believed ethically and philosophically into practice. And it was a lot of angry people dealing with bureaucracy. And a lot of really well-intentioned people. I think we tend to paint activists of any stripe as being self-interested or some sort of fundamentalist. But I think a lot of people get involved in what other people would consider inflammatory groups or into types of activism because they really are trying to reach out and help other people. And sometimes that's misdirected, and sometimes their own issues get in the way. So it was less about where I was getting my own understanding of the issues. It was more about how it was playing out in groups I was in. I was just tired of, I mean, this is the whole thing, and this is the thing with church too, that hell is other people. And so you're learning to work with other people and what that means. And certain groups can do it better than others. And so I think a lot of, yeah, the anger of a lot of activists really just made it difficult for me to continue there. So
This is kind of a wild question. As you were talking there, I was reminded of the conversation you reported in your church, the Westboro Baptist people picketing, but they have very strongly held beliefs, and they believe that, of course, they're trying to save people's souls from hell and that sort of thing, and it's their mission to do so. Indeed, perhaps their obligation to do so.
Yeah.
at cost of their own souls. In other words, they're driven by a kind of sense of virtue and of rightness. However, it's received by others as quite a sort of very confrontational, aggressive, provocative sort of display.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's a million miles away from how some people view activists.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean, I think we put certain activists in a specific group and say, well, no, they're different. But there's I mean, as you're pointing out, there is quite a similar streak in a lot of it. So,
right, but their heart's in the right place.
but their hearts are in the right
place.
places, Steve. You just don't understand.
That's an interesting recapitulation.
Yes.
Of the church ladies excusing of the Westboro Baptist people.
Yes. Well, I wonder how easy it is to lose oneself in this type of thing. You might get involved initially because you really believe in something and helping other people, and how easy it is to lose that thread. How easy it is to say, well, I'm trying to help other people. And so instead of that becoming the focus, it's the people who are perceived as the enemy. So I want to save souls, and this is the enemy that's stopping me from doing that. And so instead of focusing on the people that you want to save, you're focusing on the enemy. And I think that happens a lot with, there's always conversations in political activism on whether or not oppressed groups need other people to help them. Like if you're in feminism, if you need the help and work with men, or should you remain separate? And so it does, there's this caricature of the feminist who hates men, and I don't think that that's true for all feminists. I think it's used too broadly, but there's definitely a very easy trap to fall into, where your desire to help other people turns into a desire to crush an enemy. So I think that's something that we all have to look out for in ourselves, is what our focus is. I mean, I even though I try to stay away from things like Twitter and protests of any kind. That aspect is still part of our human condition, and the desire to, rather than getting justice for a person who needs help, getting justice by destroying someone else. So that's when your heart stops being in the right place, I think.
Interesting. The losing oneself, or maybe we could say a critical mass of accepting of certain positions. There's a critical mass, maybe we could hypothesize, where you tip over a certain point, and that there's also something about conversion that has this quality to it as well. Often if you track conversion accounts that are more gradual, there's an initial thing that made sense. Oh, this kind of made sense. I saw this and that made sense. Or I met somebody and they weren't what I expected from that group. There was a question, there was an opening, and then they said something else that made sense, and then did something else that made sense. And then I had an experience, I had a special somatic or emotional or psychological experience, and I began to realize, or was explained to me, the significance of that experience, etc., etc. I see this a lot in this podcast, in the context of Buddhism, where people begin to practice meditation, for example, for whatever attentional benefits they want to have, or relaxing benefits, or they're looking for meaning, they're looking for something more, etc. And they become exposed to doctrine, ideas, through the instructions themselves, through the personalities who are propagating those doctrines. And bit by bit, gradually, they begin to convert, actually. And then they have a special experience and interpret it within the framework that they've been reading or listening, maybe on a podcast like this, They have a special experience, and this is the arising and passing away, sort of technical term in Buddhism, right? Or this is an encounter of the no-self, right? Or this is bhanga, right? Dissolution, whatever. This is jhana, right? And then one becomes, So there's a gradual moving, in other words, from where you were before to a new thing. And some people would say that's a good thing, that's religion working. You're becoming, you're embracing the Dharma more and more fully. Others might say you've lost yourself. Some religious systems believe that holding on to oneself is part of the problem. You need to lose yourself. You need to let go of that self. That self isn't real. It's just a construction. It's not who you really are. So I suppose I'm musing on this sort of watershed, critical mass of belief. How much does it require to convert that tipping point?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what you were just saying really describes when I came into Orthodoxy, and I really had the question of, is this some sort of fulfillment of myself or a losing of oneself? I mean, I had people come like check in on me when they found out that I was looking into Orthodoxy to make sure I wasn't joining a cult. Um, they didn't even know what I was necessarily joining. They just were worried. So there was definitely a question of, um, yeah, is this fulfillment or losing of myself? So, and in Orthodoxy, it's not, we'll use terms like dying to oneself. And that's not really about the destruction of the human person, but it can sound like that, and you could easily take it that way. Um, there's who you are, and then there's all of these desires and issues and things that are surrounding that. And these things can be part of you, but they can also be destructive, or could be uh, turned the wrong way. So in C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, one of the last stories, for people who've not read it, it's a field trip to heaven from a bus of people from hell. So, I mean, in some ways, quite a fun read. But there's all these people who are searching for heaven, searching for God. They're going to the high place, and something is stopping them. And you see all these people who end up turning away because they can't get over this one thing that they're holding on to as being part of themselves. I want justice. I want the freedom to do this, or whatever it is. I want someone to say that she appreciates me, and then I'll be able to do it. But there's this guy at the end who has a like lizard that's on his shoulder that it's saying all these horrible things and stuff, and he encounters an angel right as he's about to leave. And he's like, well, I can't go now. And Lizard doesn't want to go. And the angel says, do you want me to kill it? Oh, I don't know about that. I don't know if killing it, that seems to be too much. And finally there's this back and forth. It's kind of the climax of the book. And he finally agrees and says yes. And the angel kills it. And it doesn't die, it's transformed. So this lizard that had been attaching itself to him, had been saying all these horrible things, had been really controlling his life, suddenly becomes this beautiful white horse. And he's able to jump onto the horse and ride off into the mountains where he wanted to go. So it wasn't that the desire, whatever it is, I don't know what the problem was, whatever it was, the thing itself wasn't the problem. It was where it was turned and where it was focused. So Orthodoxy talks about this, where if you're dying to oneself, we're dying to, I mean, we're in the season of Lent right now as we're having this conversation. So it's a time that we're focused on giving up things that are comfortable, things that are pleasurable, making oneself a little uncomfortable in order to really clean house. And, being hungry isn't a bad thing. It's not a sin to be hungry. But I always notice in Lent, whenever I'm starting to do some sort of fasting, that all the foods that I know aren't actually nourishing to me, that I'm craving, are coming up into my psyche. And so I'm controlled by desire that isn't helpful for me. Hunger is fine. Hunger is a neutral thing. Being hungry is something that's part of having a human body, but what am I hungry for? So I think that's where that conflict about understanding desire itself is bad, if it's directed in the wrong way, and how much that desire is part of one's being, is where we get into the issues of, are we losing yourself, or are we finding fulfillment? Because in the end goal, I mean, for Orthodox Christianity, it's theosis. It's union with God, but it's not a destruction of oneself in union with God. It's not, I'm joining with God and I'm just in this giant mass of God and other people, and we're all just in this clump. It's, I am fully who I am as God created me, without all of these problems that I'm currently facing, and I'm fully able to commune with my creator, and be fully enlightened. So, but yeah, you have to give up a lot of things on the way, and so it does feel like a losing of oneself as well. So it's always, I mean, it's always a fear, and this is a big thing. We have so many people. We were talking about internet conversion earlier. There's so many people coming into Orthodoxy or interested in Orthodoxy, more than most churches can handle right now, because it's gotten very popular online. And there's a huge, I mean, I have a lot of hesitations and fears around that. And one of them is it's very easy to find online some sort of like blueprint for how to be an Orthodox Christian. And it's not for you, it's for someone else. And it's not a fulfillment of who you are, and it's a losing of oneself. And so I think helping people who are interested in Orthodoxy find that royal path, using an Orthodox term, of not going too far on the right or the left, not politically, but too far on like the side of everything is just what you can make it, or this is the only way to do it. Finding the royal path of fulfillment of who you are, reaching towards God, union with him, trying to direct a lot of people who are coming into the church. It's a huge problem that the church is facing right now. And so I think there's going to be a lot of misunderstandings with Orthodox Christianity in general. This is a problem with all faiths, but and I'm already seeing a lot of people who came into the church and are now leaving or have left, might leave because they lost themselves, because they didn't get that direction. So yeah, this is a huge issue with conversion generally.
That's interesting. In your response there to my question, you started talking about practice. Practices like Lent, and reflection on what Lent teaches us about ourselves, in terms of, like you said, who are you, and what are the things that you just take to be you because you're so used to them, like having your junk food or whatever you mentioned. I'd like to talk about practice, but maybe we ought to do a sequel about practice.
Okay.
Maybe what we ought to do with the time we have left is finish your arc, your conversion arc. And then what I'd be really interested in doing in a sequel perhaps is to talk about practice, the practice of being an Orthodox Christian, what that means, what's been your journey into it. As you say, this aspect of it, this mystical aspect that you talked about, is so key to that faith. I would like if we could perhaps dedicate an episode to that. And also the supernatural. That's another theme, I think, that relates to that, this idea of powers and principalities, etc. And you'd remarked that you've seen some of the episodes I've done with occultists of various types who talk about, demons and things like that, angels and whatnot, that they interact with in their particular orientation, faith and practice and so on. And you have some things to say about that. So that, I think, would be very interesting to fold those two into a sequel. How do you feel about that possibility?
I feel great about that. It's very funny because the practice is so grounded, it's so earthy, of like, what are you literally doing? But that is the aspect that is most connected to this connection with the supernatural. And so that's a good bridge between we've been talking about my own personal history, and then if we do a sequel, we can kind of talk about what's going on around that. So yeah, I'm up for that.
Great. And also how that relates to community. I mean, Lent it's a practice. It's also a rhythm. It's something that you do in time, and it's something you do as a community.
Yeah.
I think too, these are all aspects of it that I think are very rich indeed.
Yeah, especially in the Orthodox Church, the way that we do Lent as a community has been so beautiful and instructive for me. So, and we can say more about that in a sequel as well.
Great. Okay. Well, let's finish this arc of conversion then, shall we?
Uh-huh.
You're mentioning this trend of people of interest in Orthodoxy, Orthodox Christianity of various types, and driven, I suppose, well, I'm curious what you think that's driven by. I suppose it's to do with Jordan Peterson and his platforming of people like Jonathan Pajot,
Mhm.
and also, and there have been a number of quite sort of internet famous conversions to. You mentioned to Orthodoxy. You mentioned Paul Kingsnorth,
Mhm.
Martin Shaw, the storyteller and mythologist, is an Orthodox Christian now. He grew up in a sort of charismatic evangelical context, I think, and now
Yeah.
he went away from that and has come back to this. So there's interesting. There's also quite a lot of Catholics happening. People
Yes.
becoming Catholics too, which is a little bit
Mhm.
similar in some ways. And a lot of this sort of driven by the internet and driven by a sort of, can we say, slightly conservative, slightly
Sure. Yeah.
dissenting, sort of right-wing-ish sort of trend stream on the internet. I'm curious what your thoughts are about that. And there are some Orthodox bishops and I don't know quite the right term, I'm afraid, or priests or clerics who are also on the internet. Some of them quite strident, actually.
Hmm.
And so there's a pipeline, in other words. That wasn't your
I,
arc, though, exactly.
no, it's not exactly. There's quite a lot of similarities, but I'm very thankful I didn't find Orthodoxy via the internet. I found all of the other things via the internet. And I didn't look into, and in fact, I remember a couple of months into visiting an Orthodox church and starting to look on Twitter and look online and just going, I don't think I need to do this. Um, I was very thankful that it was very grounded in community and very grounded in people. Um, I also came into the church pre-COVID, so it was before the big Orthodox online uh, thing had started. Uh, And so yeah, so thinking about in my own arc, I, like I said before, I kind of got to the point where I was convinced in something about Christianity. I had really come to an understanding of certain philosophical points with my worldview and with morality. There's all these things that were all there, and I knew I needed help from other people. And so in this case, I mean, this goes back to kind of the idea of what you were talking about with conversion stories generally. I knew someone who I trusted, and we never talked about, like Joshua and I never talked about faith very much. He's a very private person. And when we were in college together, I wasn't a Christian. I would make fun of Christians sometimes. And so we were friends, and we traveled together. Um, but he wasn't proselytizing. He wasn't like secretly feeding me Orthodox Christianity so I could convert. He was quite shocked when I said I wanted to come visit his church. And I think I went into it thinking of it as a show. Like, I'm going to go watch this church service and then I'm going to go do something for real. And I walked in, and I don't know, I described it as if I had been looking in a dark room for God for years and had been reaching my hand and couldn't see anything. And then I suddenly walked into this church, and my hand landed on what I'd been looking for. I didn't even know it was in the room, really. I was kind of half-heartedly looking for it, but it was there. And after the liturgy, we went over to his house, and he made me a Manhattan, and he passed it to me, and he said, "So what did you think?" And he's interested, like he's just curious. I mean, I think he knew that I was kind of going in more as a voyeur than as an inquirer. Um, and this was a whole aspect of his life that we hadn't talked about. So he asked me what I thought, and he still tells this story that I said, I don't know what I thought. I was crying the whole time. And I don't know what I was crying about necessarily. It wasn't a rational thing. There was some encounter that happened in my heart. Um, And it was a road to Damascus moment. But there's all these preparations that made it possible to have that moment. If I had visited that church a couple years before, that wouldn't have happened. And so you can see this build up to a conversion, but then there was this moment of of the vision. And so I just kept coming. And the second time I visited, they do a meal after liturgies. Many Orthodox churches do. They do at least some for coffee and snacks, but this church does a full sit-down meal. So I went to the meal. I didn't go the first time, but I went to the meal. And the priest came up to me and said, "You came back and visited. I'm so happy to see you again." I hadn't talked to him at all. I hadn't introduced myself. I hadn't seen him, interacted with him the first time I visited. This was 2 weeks later, and he remembered me. And I said, "Yeah, and I think I'm going to keep coming back." And so he said, do you want to meet to chat? And we got together, and I think we talked for more than 2 hours. And I laid out everything that we had talked about in this podcast, talked about a lot of my issues with Christianity. And I met someone who was firmly rooted in his tradition, in all of his beliefs and in all these practices, but was fully present with me and was, I mean, like, we were both crying as we were having this meeting, and I'd never had this type of experience before. And then every time I would talk with him and ask him questions, it was the expanding of the picture, like I was talking about, the getting the little bits and then starting to see the connections. And so there was this total preparation I had leading up to encountering Orthodoxy, and then there was this just kind of mystical encounter. And I spent the next several weeks, months even, every time I went to church, I would end up crying. And it wasn't for a rational reason. It wasn't because I was so overcome with emotion or because of anything in particular. I would just realize that I was crying. And so yeah, I ended up, I even though I didn't fully understand rationally what all was going on, I knew that I didn't have a choice other than to become Orthodox, that I had been given some sort of gift, and that something had been revealed to me, and I would squander a gift if I didn't fully commit. And so then I've spent ever since kind of figuring out what it means to do that, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about practice. And most days I don't think about the vision. I think about, this is hard. So yeah, so that was how I came into the church. Does that complete the arc? Do you have any other questions about the arc?
I think we should leave it there.
Okay.
Because, as you say, every question that follows up from here is going, from me anyway, is going to lead us to talk about practice. What does it mean to respond to that experience in terms of your life?
Yeah.
So I think this is a wonderful place to leave it for a cliffhanger for the sequel.
That sounds great. I'm looking forward to the sequel.
Great. Rebekah Sturgill, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.